so recording started, and we should start now, right?
Yeah.
Action.
Welcome, Martin, and thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So I live in Australia. So I live in Western Australia. So I live in Perth, which is apparently the most remote capital city in the world. So we are very far away from anywhere, right? Which is good and bad. But yeah, so I've lived here for 13 years. Previously lived in the UK. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm from the UK. I've been in this game for a very long time. So I've been in IT for about 30 years, something like that, 25, 30 years, in the integration community for most of that time. I guess we'll get on to talk about a certain conference that ran quite recently. I know a lot of the people there because the integration community is nice and small, and we're all very friendly, and we all talk to each other. So I think it's a really great community, and I've been in that community for like 15, 20 years, and it's really, really good. Background is very much in integration, IoT, data management, and data engineering, those kind of things. Obviously, nowadays, AI, because you can't do anything without AI.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're gonna definitely go into the area of integration and AI and everything. But before we start over there and before we go there, I want to talk a bit about Perth, because I was there for I think it was 10 years ago, and there was this local brewery in the harbor, the Little Creatures.
Still there.
Still there?
Still there. Yes, they do a really good mid-strength hazy ale called Little Hazy. It's fantastic. Possibly a little bit too fantastic, but it is very good. But they also recently introduced a very, very good non-alcoholic beer. So
okay. All right.
Yeah, so it's still there, still does great food, still does great pizzas, still does great nachos, still does great beer.
Yeah, and I remember the location was amazing. So I think that I need to go to Perth once again just to be.
Fremantle Harbour is very good.
And just to be, we're not in collaboration with Little Creatures. It's just.
But it's a good tips. I didn't know about it.
Yeah. I possibly am. We have a love relationship. I think me and Little Creatures.
All right, so let's dig into the integration parts, right? Or do we have anything else before?
I think we would like to hear more about before we dive into the integration part. We would like to know more about your book, and if you have a good tips about should we buy this book?
Yeah, robust cloud integrations, right?
Yeah, so that was a book I wrote. It's quite some time ago now, so it's a little bit out of date, right? I think it's fair to say that I'm probably unlikely to write a second edition. So it was me and 4 other authors. So it was done through Pact. So Pact quite often look around the world for people who are, I suppose, thought leaders or whatever you want to call, whatever that term you want to use, to bring them together to write a book. So I worked quite closely with one of the guys out of New Zealand and a few other authors, a couple of out of India, and yeah, it was an interesting experience. I think everybody has a book in them, right? I think everybody has a book in them. It was 6 months of my life writing the book. I still haven't paid off my entire advance yet, so it's just the nature of these things, I suppose. But it was a good experience because I think it probably helped. Focus in on areas that I probably wasn't so focused in. In those days, I was very much around messaging and that sort of thing, and I hadn't done a whole lot of a whole lot of logic apps, beg your pardon. And it just meant that I could concentrate really heavily on that so as we could write the book, which has broadened my knowledge more generally. So that was great. I mean, I come from a biz talk background, so I know orchestrations and all that sort of thing, but I wasn't doing a lot of that stuff in my day job. So being able to dig deeper into that, and relearning, I suppose, the new way of doing things that I've done in orchestrations was a really good experience.
So if we would ask AI bot to bring out the 3 key features of this book so we could learn, everybody in this office, what the 3 key features is, what would it say?
I think it would probably break it out into the 3 key areas of integration, right? Which would be messaging, orchestration and workflow. And then, in particular in the book, it was more about large volumes of messaging. So that those kind of like high data volumes, real-time messaging, IoT, event hubs, those kind of things. Probably a little bit too early to talk about things like event-driven architectures and that sort of thing. But because it was really just a functional book of breaking down the functional components of the integration space with a kind of like a biz talky kind of lens. because the two, myself and James, who was one of the authors out of New Zealand, we're biz talkers, right? So that's where we were coming from. so I think it's probably those areas would be the things that a large language model would pull out. You can't do integration without messaging. You can't do integration without large scale and large volumes of real time data, and you can't do integration without some kind of orchestration engine.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds amazing, and it's also I don't think any book can be outdated. It just like it creates some kind of a statement of a time. So back then it was very relevant to have BizTalk, and it's still, I think, for some more years maybe we will still be talking about BizTalk and how we relate to.
I think so, and the one thing that never goes away is messaging, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Workflow orchestration evolves in terms of what it can connect to and the flexibility of it. But that level of durability and reliability that you get with messaging and queuing and pub sub type protocols, that never goes away. That's the core part of integration, which you can't. I mean, you can do it without it, but it depends on your mileage. You may vary, sort of thing. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like really that durable layer is what really makes a proper integration pattern sing and dance.
Yeah.
Yes, great. So thank you. We will be waiting for the final edition or the updated edition soon, hopefully.
Yeah. So the announcement of that will come out about the same time as the announcement of the next version of BizTalk.
So. Perfect. We're looking forward to that then. But yeah, should we back up a bit and talk about what happened in this conference and during this summer?
Integrate, right?
Integrate 2024. And you had a great session which we called Building an Integration Solution with GitHub Copilot chat, right?
Yes. I mean, I've been to many of those conferences, the Integrate conferences. So Sarah Varner and the team are good friends of mine. And if you don't have an opportunity to go, or you do get an opportunity to go to the one next year, then absolutely do, because it's not. The one thing I love about that conference is, one, it's what Microsoft target to make sure they tell all the good stuff, right? I mean, they tell you some good stuff at Build, of course they do, because that's one of the things they have to target. But they also tell you great sort of stuff that they're going to be releasing soon at Integrate. So that's great. It's also full of integration professionals, and obviously I met you two there when I was over, and it was great because again, we're a really small group of people who just get on with everybody. And I think it's really, really, for me, that kind of like the amount of time that we get to network in that event is really, really good. And there's a lot of events that happen afterwards. There's plenty of time between sessions as well. So it's a really good opportunity for you to meet people who are like-minded because the community is small. So I've made lots of friends over the years out of that particular conference. But yeah, no, it's a great conference. And I think I chose to talk about GitHub Copilot chat. So I used to work at Microsoft in the interest of disclosure for a couple of years. And selling GitHub was one of the jobs that I had. And when Copilot chat came out, or when Copilot came out, it was this grand thing. I wanted to do something with a lot of the demos were all around, very obvious things. Here's how you fix things. Here's a piece of code, which we already know how we can fix and do things with. It's very, very orchestrated. So I wanted to see what I could do in a real world scenario where maybe I wasn't an integration professional, or maybe I wasn't. I knew how to do integration, but I didn't know how to code it. So I wanted to just see how capable it was. So that was the genesis of the talk. And I think it's fair to say, and thank you for attending the session, you could get some places, but not others. And that's not to say that you will be able to eventually get to those other places. I think it's possibly likely you never will. But I think we'll solve those, like orchestrations or workflows was a great example of that. Can't really build them very easy. But I think we'll have tools inside Logic Apps to do that for us, so that doesn't matter. So a lot of the other stuff, you can do some very interesting things in. But again, it's one of those things where, because it's trained on a massive amount of data that is the data that is there, it doesn't really learn your own stuff unless you have Windows open that already has that stuff in it, then it can learn. But yeah, so I found it really useful, but probably not going as far as I needed it to.
Yeah. I remember that you very early on in your session talked about that Copilot is biased. And can you talk about, can you explain a little bit why is it important to know, and Yeah. And what?
Yes, I mean, you can imagine that essentially what it's trained on is public repos, right? GitHub public repos. So if you think about that and you think, okay, right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my, I'm
Yeah.
going to write some C# code. That's fantastic. There's a lot of C# code in those repositories, JavaScript, all those sorts of things. I'm going to write some Python code. Again, fantastic. I'm going to write some Fortran code. Probably less fantastic because there's not as much Fortran code out there. And I think one of the examples I showed was writing assembly to read and write from a file, which it would do. It was, you'd probably never be able to execute it because you'd have to have something. You'd have to have like a runtime engine to do that.
Yeah.
But then you go to the other side of that and you go, okay. And one of the examples that I tried to show was how you could build an Azure function to read and write to a service bus queue. Now, a lot of code is using the old namespace, right? So not surprisingly, the first time you run it, it brings in a lot of code that's the old namespace, and you have to just tell it that you don't want to use that namespace; you want to use the latest namespace. So it's biased, but it's also, it doesn't devolve the developer of the responsibility to know what's current as well. So it's not like ChatGPT or any of those chat type engines. It's not like those where you just ask it to do things. You have to have the mindset that you know the kinds of things you want as an outcome.
Yes.
Right. So it's biased, and once you understand that it's biased, you need to know how to get it to work. Use that bias in your favor. I want to use the latest. I want to use the latest namespace. Give it the namespace name. Which is difficult. You'd probably know, or you could certainly look it up. So
I think I agree with you, and I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper on that, because what I saw it and what was one of the most key points and what amazed me about your session on Integrate was like you was able to actually create a whole integration within 25 minutes while talking, while having the presentation, while being under pressure,
while having fun.
Yes, exactly. So that was like
wearing a very loud shirt. Yeah.
So like it's like how do you see that is impact for like in effectivity? Because it's like I do understand what you're saying by Copilot being biased, and it's a Copilot. It's called Copilot. It's not the pilot. You are the pilot. Not
correct. And that was the point I was trying to make, right? I think it's all very well. I both like the phrase Copilot and dislike the phrase Copilot. I like the phrase Copilot because it says this thing is here to help you.
Yeah.
Right. So you're the pilot and it's there to help you. Right. So that's good. Right. It doesn't devolve you of the responsibility because you're the pilot. You're in charge. But of course, but I'm also my undergraduate degree was in aeronautical engineering. Right. So I also know planes very well. And we all know, I mean, you don't need to know planes to know this particular fact. But we all know that generally it's the first officer, it's the co-pilot who flies, right? So it's like, well, co-pilot can also mean that you're the most important person on the plane for most of the time. But that's by the by, that's just an analogy. But I think the key thing with it is, and it is about that bias, and it is about that responsibility. Where the other co-pilot tools that you find in things like Microsoft 365 and everywhere else, you can ask it to write an email that brings in information from a document and summarizes it and puts it in. That doesn't mean that at the end of that you can click send. I mean, you can, but what happens if you've got your microphone on and you're talking to somebody and you say something that it picks up and transcribes that into your email? So it doesn't remove your responsibility to look at what it's built. And I think what I was trying to show is that in areas where there's a high requirement around code, actual code, things like the example that I showed was building a function. It does an okay job once you ask it the right question. Once you prompt it in the right way, it actually does a really good job. And it's not meant to write all the code for you. It's meant to give you a starting point. So I'm actually trying to create an evolution of that presentation, which is called Building a Social Network using Copilot Chat, just to see how far I can go around building database schemas and large volume messaging solutions and so on and so forth. Because I think that lends itself much more to that sort of coding paradigm than something like a full-scale integration, which may have workflows, queuing, asynchronous processing, and so on and so forth. Because that's only bits of code rather than lots of code.
I was a bit curious also when we came home and talked about your session here at the office at Contica. But one of the things that we talked about pretty early on is that what you mentioned is also now is that you need to be the pilot. You need to be validating what actually is there after you just press send or whatever. You need to take responsibility of it. But how do you not be the one just to trust what's coming out? And how do you know what to validate, and the challenge is about what if you don't know how to validate?
So I think if you're using things like the Copilots that are in Microsoft 365, then really, as long as you can speak the language, you can validate, right? Because you can read what it says and you can understand it and you can tweak it appropriately. I don't really think that's any different when you look at GitHub Copilot chat or GitHub Copilot generally. You need to know the language that you're writing. So I need to know that if I'm writing C#, I've got a reasonable idea of what good C# looks like. I'm an architect, so I probably don't have a great idea of what C# looks like. Not anymore, but because I don't write code every day. But I think it's just another language. Languages are around semantics and syntax, and I think once you understand what good syntax and semantics are, because you've been writing the language for a while, then that's what helps. The flip side of that, and where I think Copilot Chat has two really good scenarios, is where you want to get something going and you want to be efficient. So therefore you want it to start the thing for you because you know how to flesh that out and finish it. So that's a great productivity gain. And that's where the Copilots are really, really useful. But I think the other side of that, and it's the side that probably you need to be a little bit more cautious on, is as a learning tool. Because if you want to learn how to write good C# code, as an example, it probably depends on the questions you're asking and the outcomes you get as to the value of that output. So I do think you just need to be a little bit careful. So great productivity tool, probably just about okay as a learning tool. But it doesn't devolve your responsibility to learn around the outside of that. Like anything, you go onto Microsoft Learn and you go through one of the training courses, training paths, you still have to read around it, right, to get the full picture.
Yeah.
Agree. So when you were saying about that, it helps productivity and it's not much of a learning tool, but some people have this misconception that it's a learning tool and it's like canceling your mind and your thinking process, especially the new developers. The AI is growing more and more into their work and daily work. What will be your advice to them and the best way to use it in the most balanced way?
That is a really good question. And I think it's got many answers, right? So a lot of people get really worried. I won't say terrified, but worried about their jobs and their roles when AI is brought in. AI will never be as smart as us, right?
Yeah.
AGI might be, so advanced general intelligence, that's a long way off. But in what we're doing right now with large language models, they're trained on what we have said, right? So they can never be as smart as what we are. So there's that aspect to it. I think the key thing for me around all the co-pilots and anything to do with those sorts of things is productivity. So we mentioned that, right? So if we move away from the idea that it's going to do my job for me, because you'll still have to look at the things that it produces, it just means that I won't have to spend all my time producing it. So what does that mean? So a good example here would be something like the whole no and low code revolution that's been happening over the last few years. So things like Power Platform is a good example of that. So again, as a person who used to sell solutions for Microsoft, Power Platform is really, really good at solving very specific problems. Business problems, right? Gnarly business problems, where you might have a bunch of forms, might have, really, really simple stuff to query. You can build complex applications, but you don't want to write the applications. That's a great use case for no and low code. Doesn't mean that an environment like a corporate environment is going to get away from a bunch of people who need to do development, because there'll be all the other applications that actually still need to be built because they can't be satisfied by low and no code. I don't see the co-pilots as any different to that, right? So the co-pilots are in order for me to be more efficient in my day and get more done, because really, that's a key metric that we all have. We all have KPIs around
Yeah.
this, that, and the other, right? So if I can get more done in my day, one, it means I'm less frustrated because I'm getting more done, and that's what I enjoy doing, because that's my job.
Yeah.
And two, I'm getting more done, right? So that's good for everybody.
Yeah.
I've got less frustration and I'm getting more done, right? So if I can use a tool, and the Copilot chat is a good example of this, or just GitHub Copilot generally, and I get it. Okay, well, I don't want to have to write tests. Can you write the tests for me? Yes, I can write the tests for you. Can you tell me what's wrong with this code? Because I've just inherited this piece of code and I don't know anything about it. Or can you describe this code for me? Or can you write me an MQTT message broker, because I'm transferring from Mosquito on premises to something else in the cloud? Can you write me a message broker? I want to be able to not have to Google and read through thousands of articles or hundreds of articles to get to that point. I want to create a bit of code and read through 5 articles to get some understanding. So that to me is where those sorts of tools come in. It's about productivity. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where hardcore developers are diminished and gone, because at the very least we'll have to have people write the AI solutions that produce the outcome. So we'll get away from that, right? Skynet is not about to be sentient, thankfully. But I do think we are moving towards that more sort of composable architecture, where people will write components and we'll stitch them together. Guess what? That's an integration story, right? Fantastic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even beyond that, I think we're moving towards those kind of architectures, but it won't remove the need for development. And I think that's, as a developer and as people who are developers, that's a key thing. And it's the same as if we're used to doing orchestrations in BizTalk, it's a visual interface. Logic apps, visual interface. Other integration platforms, visual interfaces for drag and drop, right? You don't need to know that under the hood there's a bunch of code that executes that action. You don't need to know those things. So that's a productivity gain right there. And Copilot Chat is no different. It's just that it's helping you with the GitHub Copilot Chat, helping you with the code, and making you more productive with the code, getting you to where you need to be quicker is really what it's about.
Yes. Agree.
So how would you say? I mean, it's a Copilot for new developers. Yes or no?
I think that's a really interesting question. And it's an interesting question because, it does get you started, which is good. So I think from a confidence perspective, it can be quite useful. And I think the example that I gave in the presentation was that I can, for reasons I don't know, I can never remember how to file I/O. I just can't. It just doesn't land and stick in my brain. I can write message brokers all day long, but I can't do file I/O. So having something that can tell me how to do that is really useful. I think if you can get it to, and we're not probably quite there, and it's an evolving tool, of course, right? So let's bear that in mind. If we can get to a point where I can build some code, run it, and debug it, and it will actually build and execute and debug, and I can see the outcomes, that to me is the golden child of that particular process. Whether the code is right or wrong, probably less important at that point, because that's part of your learning process. Yeah. So, does it write good object-oriented code? Who knows, right? That depends on the question you ask and how you ask it. And the example that I didn't have time to get to in the presentation was getting it to start splitting things out from a piece of monolithic code into methods, and then using interfaces and all that sort of stuff. It does a really good job of that, right? So if you've got the basics, it can do a reasonable job at building the skeletal code that helps you get to where you need to go. But it doesn't write your code for you, so you still have to learn that stuff. Yeah, so exactly. GitHub Copilot for people who are starting, okay. But but it's like any tool, you need to know the questions to ask it and how to use it properly.
All right. Great
totally
answer.
Agree. Yeah. It's interesting to see how this will develop in the near future.
Yeah. And look, honestly, with the other parts of GitHub as well, things like the advanced security and other things like that, and when they start plugging some of these sort of enterprisey type tools together with things like project management and task management and issue management and all those sorts of things, you can see, you can see a time that's where you might say, right, I want you to write this piece of code. I want you to create a pull request, and then you want to send you a message to this person to do a code review, and then give them an automation that will allow me to merge that request and then push it to prod. Yeah, as a single stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
Will we get there? I don't know. It's
Yeah.
the tools are there. Can we find
Yeah.
something that will automate all that together? Who knows?
Yeah.
Exciting times though.
So we talked about Copilot being biased, and we here at Contica has talked a lot about what does it mean to be biased and how do you change someone's mind, and in this case Copilot, how do we, when we have a new idea, a better solution for something, and like we start to push this to GitHub, and I mean, how long would it take to actually for GitHub Copilot to change its mind to be like,
Yeah,
now it's
so
this?
that's a really interesting question. I don't know what schedule it runs on in terms of how
Yeah.
often it trains itself. But like anything else, when an idea sparks a community, a lot of people jump in, right? And a lot of people generate good quality output. I like to think of myself as a fast follower of technology rather than an early adopter of technology. I mean, there are certain things I absolutely love early adoption on, but fast following does mean that you ride on the coattails of those people who have done the work before you. So I don't know how often it happens, but at the same time, if you've got a bunch of windows open that have code in them, then it can inspect those as well, right? Or it will inspect those as well. So, a great example might be things like patterns and practices, for instance, which it may not be able to pick up from a bunch of data that's in repos, but it can certainly do some of those things if you've got things that are already open, right? So I guess the simple answer to that is that, like all things, and like bias more generally, if you look at cultural bias as a good example, cultural bias can take decades to change. Right now, I'm not saying GitHub Copilot will take decades to change, because the rate of change of those kind of solutions is much greater, but it does require time. So I think if there is a brand, we all know JavaScript changes with the flip of a coin, right? So if there is a brand new JavaScript framework tomorrow, will you be able to get a bunch of information out about it? Probably not right away, right? Will you be able to in a week's time? Depends on how many people have pushed code, and whether that has been brought into the model. And I think that's it's always worth remembering, right? But then we should also never be afraid about the fact that when it comes to building solutions, we can only build solutions with the information that we have, right? So I'm very famous in my current job of saying the only wrong decision is indecision, right? So sometimes you have to make a decision to choose a particular technical path because you've got to basically get stuff done. So sometimes you just have to live with the fact that you might have to refactor. You might have to have a small amount of technical debt whilst you solve a problem. And in software delivery, and integration is just a part of software delivery. You know what? That's actually okay. So we can't always expect to have something that's got the latest and greatest because it's just not available yet. And honestly, if that is the case, and there is something that's at the forefront of everything else, Google it, right? Because again, it's a tool, so it will get you some of the way, but it won't solve all of your problems. So it doesn't devolve you the responsibility of doing your own groundwork.
Yeah. All right. So it's
but it's really interesting perspective you have, and of course, after watching your session and like hearing all of this, it's like get even more inspired. And it made me think about how you actually, like, since we're talking about that, we cannot just jump in with the newest of the newest, like just implementing everything and get follow the hype. Thinking about what you actually working in your focus area, which is healthcare, and how do you think this AI wave is affecting this area?
Healthcare is a really interesting one, right? Because what you can't do is prescribe things. You can't go, okay, well, given the things that you've told me, you have this disease, right? Because you can't predict that sort of stuff. Because if you do, you have to be 100% sure that the prediction is correct, right? And like most things, and if we all remember the early days of machine learning, and I don't mean the early days of machine learning, that's 60, 70, 80 years ago, right? But in terms of the machine learning revolution and the volume and so on and so forth, data volumes and everything else, a lot of people realized very early on that their maturity in that space wasn't as high as they thought it was, right? Because they didn't understand their data. This is no different, right? So I think it's like any tool that will take some time to mature. We're not there. So things like healthcare is a good example. Also very litigious in certain jurisdictions. You can't make a prediction of someone's health outcomes based on a model alone. You have to have a doctor there. What you can do is go, okay, well, when I present at a doctor's, I'm going to fill in a form. Right, I'm going to fill in a questionnaire. Having filled in that questionnaire, how do I feel? What the various things are? When I go for my consultation, maybe at that point, I'll send a message. The AI will send a message to the doctor that says, this person, as Martin has presented with these conditions, it could be possibly one of these 5 things. And what it does is, again, it's a productivity tool, right? What it's doing is getting the doctor a head start. So they don't have to ask all those questions, which makes the consultation much better. If you think about the back end of that, maybe the doctor, I don't know if you've ever seen GP surgery sort of systems and things like that. GPs don't tend to write full words for things when they're doing summaries. They tend to use codes. Those codes are very standard across the world. Taking that and translating that into something that's meaningful to the person who's just been to see you, which is some of the stuff that health data services can do inside Azure. There's a lot of things around those sorts of things, right? And follow-ups, or all that kind of automation stuff. This person presented at this point. We need to have a follow-up appointment, and then have some kind of automation across the back of that. That's just automation, but if you can build some smarts into that as well with an AI process, so much the better, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do that don't mean that you have to go, this AI is now your doctor, and he's going to diagnose you, and he's going to prescribe you, because we are so far away from that. We'll probably never ever get there. And ironically, I like to think of that as from a co-pilot perspective. I don't think we'll ever remove pilots out of planes, because anybody who knows the automation systems on planes knows that sometimes they can go a little bit wrong.
Yes, track out.
And let's just leave it there. Right? But so having a pilot who can push the button and turn it off is super, super important. And we have automated vehicles, we have automated taxis in some countries now as well, and that's a relatively simpler problem to solve, but they still crash.
Yeah.
Right, because humans haven't been removed from every part of that system, because there are still cars being driven by humans, and they're less predictable. So the automated systems can't do all of it, and it's the same. It's the same with co-pilots. They can't do everything, so you have to assume that there has to be some human interaction somewhere. And healthcare is a great example of where you need that human interaction.
Yeah, definitely.
You can't predict everything using AI, or even humans themselves cannot predict everything.
No.
Correct.
And it's quite. There is too many questions in my head now, and I just want to get it. But I know that we're gonna keep talking for the whole day. And
we got another 3 or 4 hours. That's fine. Yeah.
but I think it was like the most key takeaway here, that if we just look at it, our conversation and your session, that yes, AI is biased, and we need to be cautious while we're using it, and make sure that it's only put it in its place, which is assisting us. Which is I started to do that personally here back at our office, that we started to create some kind of prompt library that we can reuse.
Yes, love it.
And that was one of the things that actually I learned from your session, that you had those kind of ready prompts that you already have been
yes, demo gods. You see, demo gods. As I showed in the session, right? The amount of times that I used those prompts and got a completely different answer. Even in the example that I showed, where I assumed it would output C#, because that's what it had done every time, and it output JavaScript.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So you took a bit of a risk there, showing it on.
But then validate. You need to validate.
Yeah,
Correct.
Validate,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, let's move on to the next topic, I guess. We will talk about
Yeah.
the new technology, and then specifically now then from Microsoft. And
Yes.
what do you see in the near future or in the far future? And what are you looking forward to in the new technology that's coming up?
Well, I'll talk about a couple of sessions one session in particular that I really, really
Mm.
enjoyed at Integrate, and it's still in preview, I'm pretty sure, which is API Center.
Mm.
So, I grew up working at a big IT services company in the UK, whose view was to create essentially kind of almost like a catalog approach to creating services. So a lot of that was built around SOAP in those days, because that's what the thing was. It was all SOAP. BizTalk was taking care of the process services. We had other things around user identification services, but all of that was bound to an ability to discover things, because a service is completely useless if you don't know where it is and what it's doing.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, from an integration perspective, what we care about is building those services so as they're useful. Of course, we do.
Mm.
But reuse is where the secret sauce is, right? Because what you want is reusability. That's about discovery, right? So in the old days, that used to be UDDI. I don't know if you two remember UDDI. I certainly do, because I'm very old. So UDDI was one of those tools that seemed like a great idea. It is a service catalog that you can build, and it's great. I looked at API Center and I thought that is such a great evolution of that kind of tool. And when you're adding OpenAI specifications and so on and so forth, and the ability to test, and you think you got some of that sort of thing in the developer portal for API management, and that's just a supercharged version of that, right? And I suppose I was a little bit confused as to why you couldn't import things from API management into API Center, but they'll get around to that. But I think some of then you start building AI tools around that, right? So then your discovery is fueled by AI, and they did show some of those things. And I think that's going to be such a powerful tool, because we're we're continuing to march down the path towards an API economy. Of course, we've been down that path for the last 10 years. But we talk about democratization of things. So machine learning, building machine learning models and publishing them, democratizing them. Copilots are just a democratized version of AI. I'm not going to build a GPT tool because I don't have a huge data center that I can dedicate, the electricity of a small city to for 4 months. I don't have that capability. But what I want is to use that tool. And I think some of that stuff around API Center, and if you can globalize something like that. Can you imagine if I can just use an AI tool and say, right, I want to build a weather service that's tied together with these things and a few other things, and I want to know the best services to use based on recommendations, as an example, and I want them to be cost effective. Okay, fantastic. And then you build some fabric around that, which says, okay, well, now I know what you want. Every month, I'm going to go, that service over there does the same thing, and this month is $4 cheaper. So I will rewire that, and I'll do all the transformation for you because I know what you want. I know how you're interacting with these. You can imagine starting to build those sorts of things, and then all I'm responsible for is building my actual application.
Yeah.
And I think you get stuck in the enterprise around APIs that are very specific. But all an API is presenting data, and the value is in that data. So if we can provide a way of making that data available in a meaningful way, API, we can discover that through things like an API Center, and then ultimately have some kind of brokerage and wiring around that as well. That to me tells such a great story around what we can achieve from an integration and development perspective. So I think that was one great story around API Center. And the other one I wanted to call out was the real-time intelligence and that large-scale volume of data. So I think event hubs supercharged a bit more and going beyond that. Because again, the value's in the data, right? And whilst we're used to data lakes, data warehouses, and all of those sorts of things, which are great from a reporting tools perspective, we don't make decisions. Well, we make decisions on reports, of course we do, but we tend to want to make decisions on more real-time data. So when there is that kind of real-time decision making that we need to make, great, that's fantastic. There's a person there. What about if we could automate some of those and apply some AI to those? so as we can automate, the 80% of cases
Hmm.
and only throw out the 20% of cases that are exceptions.
Hmm.
So I think that real-time data flow and intelligence and
Yeah.
that ability to discover things, those two stories to me sparked such a great opportunity that we have in the integration community in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. So those are the two call-outs I thought about.
It's great. It's great. That sounds like an interesting future for
Yeah,
everyone in
it
the
sounds like
integration.
we have our next session also about real-time intelligence, because I really like it. I love how you have orchestrated a new business idea now, and like how can we just like put this together?
Yeah.
Coming to Azure Marketplace soon. Maybe. Who knows?
Big announcement. Okay. So yeah, this topic is related to integration love story. And since we're working with the integration, and everyone in this room and listeners probably, they all have, and you definitely have, a love story where that love sparked. Like, this was it for me. This was the customer. This was the solution. So what's your integration love story?
So it's actually very early on in my career. So I'd been doing bits and pieces around integration, and I'd as a result of working for the organisation I was working, talking about around SOAP and all those sorts of things, and using BizTalk. As part of that organisation, I worked for a big grocery store in the UK who I won't name. They were looking to find a solution, right, to fresh produce. Because fresh produce comes in, it gets tested, and it takes the buying managers 3 months to get the data, because it's all handwritten and somebody has to transpose it into a database and so on and so forth. Really, really tricky stuff. Actually, not surprisingly not tricky, right? So they came up with an idea of using these ruggedized Palm Pilots that had standard forms that a person could fill in. They dock it, it would download, it would FTP it to a location, and there'd be a bunch of smarts off the back of it. That was in 2002. BizTalk 2000 come out, and was a bunch of tools that kind of did sort of work together, but not really very well. 2002 came out, it was a bit better. 2004 came out a little bit after that, right? But I got the idea of using BizTalk into this particular organization just as a trial, just kind of almost like a POC, right? So that was kind of one of those things that just evolved from that point in my career. 2 years later, when I went to a bank to work there, and 2004 came out, BizTalk 2004 came out, a much more robust product. I remember spending time just creating integrations in and out of their mainframe. Right, so it was a Unisys mainframe. And it was something that was really, 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 really hard before then. As in developers being chucked at this thing for weeks and weeks and weeks and months and years to try and solve what was essentially a pretty simple problem. Because we had the kind of the nascent version of host integration server in those days as well, and it just worked. It just worked. Worked is a relative term, obviously, but it just worked, right? And you kind of go, "That's amazing," right?
Yeah.
And then as time moved on with BizTalk, and it's funny. So Clemens Vastas, the architect for the messaging team, he posted something on LinkedIn a couple of days ago around the Azure Relay.
Yeah.
And I said to him, I commented on his message, on his post, about the fact that, hang on, that looks to me like, wasn't that what the Internet Service Bus was? Which is this ability to tunnel through, right, from one place to another place.
Yeah.
And it is. It's the same process, same product, right? That's 10 years old. I think it was 10 years old, right? And you kind of go, that is still one of the core things in the integration suite at Microsoft, because it's such a useful product. So I had that experience from when BizTalk started, and then having that really solvable problem that had been almost an intangible problem beforehand. Yeah. And then fast forward a little bit more, and that ability to then use use a new technology to not just go inside my own domain, but actually reach out and go elsewhere by just having this thing on both sides and tunneling through. Those two things just sparked so much like knowledge and love in my head, which is weird. I don't tell that story down the pub with my friends because they're not.
That's great that we got this.
They tend to walk out.
Yeah. I think that it requires a bit of
a specific atmosphere. Yeah,
a specific
Yeah,
atmosphere.
it requires the right audience, right? So, but it is one of those things, and as you say, we all have those stories, right? And I'm always fascinated by what gets people's juices flowing when they're interested in things. Because honestly, and that's why it's a great question, Robin, by the way, because actually, it's that thing that keeps us coming back, right? Mm-hmm. It's that thing that makes us invest our time to learn more stuff. We all need that aha moment, that eureka moment where we go, oh, yeah, I just get that now. And I think integration is, because it's between everything, it's such a great area to have that aha moment in.
Yeah. And as you said, I mean, what I hear and what I can definitely connect with is it just works, and it's such a great feeling, and it's like it shows up here, and it just works. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And I'll go back to what I was saying earlier on about durable messaging. When you understand asynchronicity and the importance of solving these really complex distributed transaction problems between multiple systems. And how you manage that, and how you roll back and do various other things, and compensate when you don't have idempotency, and all of those big intransigent problems that you get with distributed transactions and large scale integration. Queues are at the forefront of all of that stuff, right? And queues have been around forever. I mean, they're a standard solution to problems that goes back 40 or 50 years, and they're still so relevant now. It's just an amazing story.
Yeah. It's great, and thanks for that, and thanks for the integration love story.
Yes, that was an amazing.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I think we are reaching our end, and we don't want to keep you longer here.
No, that's fine. I've got time. Yeah.
Because we also would like you to come for the next time, because I really interesting to book another session for talking about real intelligence. Real time intelligence, which is like a really nice topic. Now you session, we can hear about that later.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
If we want to let our audience and people who are listening to this now, where they can find you, how if they should keep an eye on something that's going to happen soon.
Yeah. So easily found on LinkedIn, of course, Martin Abbott, ABBT. So find me, hit me up, and I'm always happy to have conversations and give my time, because we're all better as a community, right? I think the Integrate conference is testament to that, right? I see the same faces year after year after year who come along, because they know how important it is to spend 2 or 3 days of time and financial investment with people who are similar-minded. So there's that. I run a user group here in Perth, which is called the Perth Azure User Group. I also help. So BizTalk Bill, I suppose he still has to be called BizTalk Bill, because BizTalk is still a thing.
Yes, I agree with you.
Logically now he's Logic Apps Bill, but he's a very good personal friend of mine. So him, myself, and a few other people in this jurisdiction, Dan Toomey and Wayne Silvera and McBadron, we run an integration down under user group. I'm also one of the people who helps bring Global Azure to life every year. So if you want to know about things happening in Perth, things happening in the Asia Pacific around integration, reach out. If you want to know about Global Azure, reach out. And if you want to know about things more generally, also reach out. Like I said, I'm always happy to have conversations, and I know a lot of people in the community, so I can always spread the word and spread things out and usually find answers to questions. So,
yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think that the really last thing we want to ask, because we have more people come up in this podcast, and so do you have any specific questions that you want to pass on to our next guests?
So I think the most important one it's one I've touched on in terms of the future of integration. Is I would be really keen to hear other people's ideas around the intersection of AI and integration more generally. And I don't mean just the tools that we have, Logic Apps, Service Bus, so on and so forth. I mean, integration of not just two systems, but integration more generally. How do we integrate building management systems meaningfully into policy around the environment? I'm really, really interested in the intersection between the actual core of AI, which is just intelligence, and solutions that help bring the data from one place to another place that can that AI can make use and sense of. That to me is where I think
Where the magic can happen.
culturally we have to go, and that is a huge integration problem because that's where the data is. We can't make those determinations without the data, and that's where integration is.
All right, so we will definitely touch on those topics for the next guests, and I guess that's it then.
That's it for us today. Thank you for being with us. And,
no problem. Thank you for inviting me.
We'll get to the next session, talk more about more interesting topics with you, and it's gonna be soon.
It's gonna be soon. Yeah.
I'll be here.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. And from Gothenburg, in a sunny Gothenburg, even though it's in September.
And a wet Perth. Wet and cold Perth.
Yeah, all right. So thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.